Thanks for coming for another round. Tonight's the night we get to the Baptist fight of the 1980s, and we'll look at just do a quick review of some of this before we get there. Am I? Yeah. So the first night we did just a fast run through Baptist history from the beginning of the church and marked it all the way to Second-Ponce in 50 minutes. Last week we talked about the Baptist, the four fragile freedoms and the distinctives that make Baptist, and set up the split that happened in the 1980s. Because we talked about last week of the four fragile freedoms, church freedom means that all Baptist churches are self-governing, right? So no bishop, no hierarchy. What this church decides in church and conference is the final word, and that is true of all Baptist churches, which is why Baptist churches can be of all stripes and all flavors, because whatever they vote for themselves is who they are. And last week, we talked about two generalized traditions in Baptist life. The Charleston tradition that represents kind of the coastal churches, the New England churches, some of the first settled Baptist churches in the U.S., who came out of the English tradition, which influenced their architecture, but they also represented an educated clergy and were marked by their dignified worship and a more progressive theology. But also, there was in North Carolina and other parts, kind of more in Appalachia, a revivalism tradition among Baptists. It was more marked by tent revivals and more uneducated preachers who had fervor. You might know that the symbol for the revolution, is that right? The Latin words, help me here, for order and ardor, right? In a balance, in a scale. So not all of our Baptist churches have balanced order and ardor. And the Charleston tradition probably balanced more on order. The Sandy Creek tradition more on ardor, this heartfelt revivalism tradition. And we noted last week that nobody fits easily or cleanly into either one of those traditions, right? We're on a continuum. We noted that Second-Ponce is more in the Charleston tradition, but certainly not just completely given away to the Charleston tradition. We have some ardor around here, don't we? There's some revivalism. We care about individual salvation. We do a call to come forward and join the church, and we baptize people. That's part of our revivalism heritage. It's a part of who we are. Every church is just somewhere on this continuum line, right? More in the Charleston tradition or more in the Sandy Creek tradition. But I want to clear up some things that I might not have said well last week in my hurry. Neither of these traditions is inherently good or bad, right? There are some wonderful Charleston tradition churches and some really, really bad ones. And I was raised, many of you were raised in some wonderful Sandy Creek tradition churches. The church, First Baptist Church Doraville, would be more on the Sandy Creek end of the continuum. That's where Melissa and I grew up, and they nurtured us and loved us and taught us the faith. So neither of these is bad or good. These are just representative. It's also oversimplifying to say that all of the Sandy Creek churches are uneducated. All of them are in the country. That's not true. There are some tall steeple Sandy Creek churches that are pockets of fundamentalism. They're born out of that tradition of Sandy Creek, but they are now have an educated clergy and they have big steeples and all of that. So I'm using a little bit of shorthand in all of this, and so call me on it if any of it needs explaining. Also, we noted last week that we're using terms in this conversation that are charged with all kinds of meaning. So, for instance, we talk about churches being more conservative or more liberal. That is not a political designation, right? It has more to do with how strictly they interpret the scripture. The more conservative the church, the more strictly they adhere to the word-by-word interpretation. The more liberal the church tradition, the more interpretive allotment there is, right? So let me give an example. Women deacons. The Bible says a deacon should be the husband of one wife. The most conservative interpretation means that is only a male, because only a male can be the husband of one wife. A more progressive interpretation is that was in its context, it had to do with the time it was written. Women were property. What it's speaking to is the kind of character a deacon ought to have, right? So do you see what I mean by conservative and liberal? So anytime you're confused about these tags and lines, let's throw up a hand so we get back on the same page. Some of that I felt like I needed to kind of go back over from last week. So let's get into fighting. Let me get my water. Let's talk about the controversy. When we ended last week, we had noted that because of local church autonomy, Baptist churches are just all over the board, right? We've got extremely conservative churches in Appalachia who've got a bivocational preacher with no education who's just getting up and doing the best he can. And we've got extremely liberal churches in the Baptist tradition. Most of those still robe, they still have the split chancels, they're right. Those two can't hold together in company forever. But let me give you the specifics of what led to the controversy of the 1980s. First, let me just say that Baptists have fought long before the 1980s. There have been some really significant controversies across the Baptist landscape. By the way, let me say a quick word about the Eliot controversy. In the 1950s, the Broadman commentary, most of y'all have seen or have a set of the Broadman commentaries. If you've ever noticed closely, Volume 1, Genesis, says revised, because the first time it came out, the version of that commentary was deemed too liberal, and it caused a big stir. And so it was pulled off the shelf, and the revised one went in, and most of the sets you've ever seen, it says revised. But somehow, somewhere, somebody gave Charles Qualls an original Genesis commentary from the Broadman. He's the only person I know who's got an original version of that commentary. But then the one we're focusing on tonight, the controversy in Baptist life, is this moderate conservative controversy of the 80s. So let me set up what was stirring. the conservative part of the Baptist tradition is by far the largest in number, right? Think about all of those small country churches you pass in rural Georgia, just one right after the other, right? Those of us more in the Charleston tradition are the minority in Baptist life. And because of a lot of bivocational pastors and all of that, the head count is far more conservative. But all of the agencies and institutions in the 1970s were being led by people out of the Charleston tradition. Does this make sense? Every seminary president was educated and progressive, was on the liberal end of things. The seminary faculties, obviously, were all educated and tended toward that more liberal interpretation of Scripture rather than the more conservative interpretations. So you see what's out of balance. Most Baptists are favoring the conservative interpretations. All of the Baptist leadership, head of the Sunday school board, the foreign mission board, the home mission board, all of those people were out of the Charleston tradition, out of this smaller group. And the uprising that happened was really in response to that inequity, that there was no real representation of the larger, more conservative part of the Baptist tradition, right? Is this making sense? All right. I'm going to give you a minute to read this, just because what I found interesting in it is this is the Wikipedia entry on the takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. And you noticed that in the Wikipedia entry, my predecessor, Russell Dilday, is prominent in that entry. That was just, I was just piddling around to find how folks were representing, what kind of language they were using about this, and just found it interesting to find a Second-Ponce predecessor. Gail?
Some of us have old eyes, and so sitting this far back, I'm having trouble reading that. Can I trouble you to read it?
If my old eyes will do it, I will certainly try. Gail was saying that not everybody's able to read this small font, so let me try. The Southern Baptist Convention Conservative Resurgence, 1970 to 2000, was an intense struggle for control of the SBC's resources and ideological direction. The major internal disagreement captured national attention. Its initiators called it a conservative resurgence, while its detractors have labeled it a fundamentalist takeover. Russell Dilday, president of Southwestern from 78 to 94, described the resurgence as having fragmented Southern Baptist fellowship and as being far more serious than a controversy. Dilday described it as being a self-destructive, contentious, one-sided feud that at times took on combative characteristics. Since 1979, Southern Baptists had become polarized into two major groups, moderates and conservatives. Reflecting the conservative majority votes of delegates at the 1979 annual meeting of the SBC, the new national organization officers replaced all leaders of Southern Baptist agencies with presumably more conservative people, often dubbed fundamentalists by dissenters. The official Wikipedia entry. So this is how they went about it. Two very smart men in the conservative tradition, Paige Patterson, who ended up becoming one of the seminary presidents after the resurgence or takeover, and Paul Pressler, a judge in Texas. They were the masterminds of how this takeover could be accomplished. This was their strategy. They recognized that all of the agencies and institutions of the Southern Baptist Convention were governed by a board of trustees. So all the seminaries, the Home Mission Board, the Foreign Mission Board, the Sunday School Board, the board of trustees governed that agency. The person who was elected president at the annual convention of Baptists was empowered to appoint the open seats for the trustee boards of all the agencies and institutions. So if one person rolled off of the Sunday School Board, that elected president got to name the replacement to be on the Sunday School Board of Trustees. So they strategized that if they could get a fundamentalist candidate elected enough consecutive years, he could appoint enough conservative trustees to take back, in the conservative language, to take back the Southern Baptist Convention. The progressives would say to take over the Southern Baptist Convention, right?
With me.
This strategy began taking effect in 1979. Was there another question? Okay, I thought this is when they began implementing this strategy to get the vote, as many votes as possible. So they had a grassroots campaign to get all of these conservative churches to, and literally they were busing people in for Tuesday afternoon of the meeting. Tuesday afternoon was when the president got elected. And so the hall would just be filled to the brim on Tuesday afternoon. The election of the president would happen. Those buses would load up, go back. They did this successfully and consecutively enough time in the 1980s to affect the complete change and turnover of all the Southern Baptist agencies and institutions. Well, there we go. Let me go back because this next one gets pretty thorny. We got any questions so far? I've got that in here. He was not let. He was fired, but he was not the first one fired. He was fired as a part of this takeover. The question was, when was Russell Dilday fired as a part of this? My predecessor, the third pastor of Second-Ponce, was president of Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and after this takeover happened, he was fired. And when he was fired, when the trustees brought him in to fire him, they had already hired a group to be changing the locks on his office. While he was in the meeting to be fired, they were changing the locks on his office. We'll get to that in a minute. So the strategy, how did they get, you can't get all of these people in these rural churches and all these Baptists riled up enough about who's on the board of trustees at the Sunday school board to take a day off of work and get on a bus and go vote. So there was an ideological strategy that was taking place below the political strategy. And it was around inerrancy. Let's talk about that. Well, all right. So, we could do 4 nights on biblical interpretation and inerrancy, so y'all stop me if this doesn't make sense. I'm going to do it too fast. But the conservatives in the Baptist tradition were insisting that particularly the seminary professors adopt inerrancy as the only right way to interpret the Bible. Inerrancy means without any error. right? On any matter. Well, most seminary presidents and faculty members and people in the Charleston tradition would not accept that language. Instead, they preferred the language of infallibility, that the Bible cannot fail regarding matters of faith and Christian practice. The Bible is holy, useful, and true. What's the difference, right? Well, without any error, we've got different versions, and some of our versions, your version might have been from an older transcript than my version, and they might have changed this word, and so which one was completely without error, and which one's, and so the conservatives insisted it's completely without error in its original autographs. Well, nobody's ever seen the original autograph, so that's a moot point. This gets all circular, right? But here's where it comes down. They had the rally cry. The seminary professors don't believe the Bible. They don't believe it's inerrant. And we've got to do something about it. We've got to change these agency heads and these seminary professors who don't believe the Bible is true. Every professor I had believes the Bible is true. They don't use the language of inerrancy, right? Let me give one example about in all the difference between regarding Christian faith and practice and being completely without error. Here would be one example. One of the Psalms talks about God's grace or whatever reaching the four corners of the world. Well, in the era that it was written, the common knowledge was that the world was flat, right? So, the psalmist is operating out of his worldview that God's grace reaches to all four corners of the world. Well, the Bible didn't intend to be a book on astronomy, but what he said about God's grace is absolutely true. But it wasn't supposed to be about whether the world was flat or round. Does this make sense? All right. That's why the seminary professors would not warm up to this idea of inerrancy, but instead infallibility. We're there? I know that's kind of muddy, but we're all right? We're okay. All right. So, they got things frothed up on that. We can't have professors anymore who don't believe the Bible. So, y'all need to get out there, load the church van, show up to the convention, and vote these cats out of power. And beginning 1979 and through the 80s, that campaign continued to ramp up. The largest convention, I think it was either Dallas or Fort Worth, it got into 45,000 people in 1985 because of this. Now, let me say, once this campaign got out and got noted for what it was, there was a backlash, and the moderates were holding political meetings and getting people to get in their vans and alt-right. It was the moderates were down in the dirt on this thing too, trying to preserve the votes and all of that. So both sides of this controversy are just in a big froth, and 45,000 people showing up to conventions. But over the course of however many years, they did get the votes. So they would elect a fundamentalist president who would appoint fundamentalist trustees. Then the next year, same thing, but different boards had different numbers of trustees, and different boards had different numbers that needed to be replaced. So all of the boards and agencies didn't fall at the same time, right? So, to Tom's question now, Randall Lolly was president of Southeastern Seminary, where I was a student. I graduated in 1987, and my diploma was the last one he signed. In 1988, they had gained control of the trustees of Southeastern Seminary, and Randall Lolly was fired. By 1994, they had gained control of the trustees of Southwestern, and Russell Dilday was fired. This, just whenever the control marker hit, another agency or institution turned in its flavor. This is what led to the formation of the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. The disenfranchisement of the group that was voted out of position and power said, now what are we going to do? Are we going to continue to send our money to support the people who just changed the locks on Russell Dilday's office, right? This is what... So there was a meeting at the Inforum here in Atlanta, and it wasn't CBF at the time. I don't know what it was called. It was just the meeting, and so many people showed up that they had rented one room to have this meeting, a big room, but so many people showed up that they kept unlocking other rooms and putting up closed circuit television, rooms that had not yet been paid for. I attended this meeting. I was 20-something years old. I was in one of those rooms with a closed circuit. And I remember Jimmy Allen, some of y'all know that. Jimmy Allen came to give the offertory prayer. And Dr. Allen said, we're going to pass chicken buckets or something. I don't know what it was. He said, but before I do, I want to urge you all not to reach in your pocket and grab money, because you didn't bring enough cash. We got to have checks. We hadn't paid for this thing yet. Y'all have got to put checks in this offering plate. But it was an energizing of that group that for a decade had now been voted out and disenfranchised. And over the next years, what year? Yeah, I was, Barbara's asking what year, like I said, I was about 27. I should have that in the presentation. Would one of y'all Google that? 1990. 1990?
The website says 91 is when the CBF was formed.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So that meeting would have been 1990. CBF would have been formed 1991. That sounds right. And it wasn't formed as a denomination. They didn't know what to call themselves. It wasn't a new denomination. It was just, mainly, it was a way first, it was found as a way to redirect money to support missionaries who were now in danger, because if they didn't align with the new people in power, they too might be fired. And so the first movement of the Cooperative Baptists was to collect money to keep those missionaries on the field. But the first crisis for moderate Baptists was a seminary crisis, because now that the 6 Southern Baptist seminaries had taken on a decidedly and self-appointed fundamentalist agenda, it meant that a lot of the people who were studying at these seminaries were feeling exiled, particularly the women, because once again, one of the fights that was inside of this fight in the 1980s was women in ministry. And the more conservative the interpretation on that continuum, women can't be ministers. And so when this took on a very conservative new leadership, all of the women in seminary had no place to go. They weren't going to be affirmed. And then people in churches like this one would go to, in the 1990s, who would have been pastor? David Sapp would go to David Sapp and say, I feel called to ministry. Where should I go to seminary? And for years he'd been saying, go to Southern Seminary like I did, and like my mentor did, and like his mentor did. And now all of a sudden, the folks in the Charleston tradition didn't know what to do about folks who were coming and saying, I want to go to seminary. This crisis is what led to 9, I know that's a little overwhelming, but 9 new seminaries opening in the 1990s. The first response to the seminary crisis was from the Methodists. Emory University and Duke University already had seminaries. They saw what was going on. They saw this landscape shift. So both of those seminaries hired a Baptist professor to teach Baptist polity, Baptist ministry, right? So you would take your Hebrew and New Testament courses from the faculty at Emory, but you would take your Baptist courses from the Baptist professor they just hired. Does this make sense? So for a while, the folks in the kind of Charleston tradition of Baptist life went to Duke and Emory. The youth minister who followed me, I was a youth minister in Warrenton, North Carolina when I was in seminary. And the youth minister who followed me enrolled in Southeastern. You remember my president was fired the next year, the whole thing changed. He transferred to Duke University and got his MDiv from the seminary at Duke. That was the first response. Then the Baptist Theological Seminary at Richmond was the first of the new Baptist seminaries to open. It was freestanding, and they hired some kind of exiled seminaries professors, mostly from Southeastern, and they opened a freestanding seminary. Unfortunately, because we oversubscribed and built too many seminaries in the 1990s, Richmond didn't survive. And about 3 years ago, they closed their doors and went under. For the good part about that story for us, there are very few good parts of that story, but it meant that Allie Osborne had no place to go. She was a student at BTSR. When they closed the doors, she had done about a year's work, and so she transferred to the McAfee School of Theology and finished there, which is how we ended up finding her. McAfee, our closest sister school in this list, opened in 1996. And I was hired in 1995 as the first admissions director. And for 9 years, I recruited students for that school. And then I had 2 other jobs. I gave leadership to a $2 million Lilly grant, and then moved to be a professor after that. 18-year career at McAfee. But John Oldrick is a graduate of McAfee. Most of the more recent staff members at Second-Ponce are McAfee grads. Although Heather was Gardner-Webb, and we've got some other sprinkling in there too. Oh, that's right, Campbell. She was Campbell. That's right, not Gardner-Webb. Thank you. She was at Campbell. So how did the local churches respond to all of this that was going on at the national level? Well, as you can imagine, there were a whole lot of churches who just thought, this has nothing to do with us, right? I go to Sunday school and hug people at the door and go home. This is some political fight at a national level that has nothing to do with me. Some of the churches were very embroiled in all of this. But most churches, this church included, is a mix of people with affinity for the Charleston tradition and the Sandy Creek tradition. Most churches of any size have folks who are more fundamentalist and more liberal. We are a big tent church. And so most of the SBC pastors, if they didn't have to deal with it, kind of didn't, because they knew it was going to be a fight if they had to deal with it. So most of them just kind of left it alone. Some churches, remember local church autonomy, some churches voted to stay aligned with the SBC completely, actually took church action to do that. Some churches, very few, voted to leave CBF and align completely with the Cooperative Baptists. But we are among the churches that developed a compromise solution. What many big tent churches did, like Second-Ponce, was allow individuals to designate their portion of the mission giving around their conscience. So, when it came time to make your pledge for the coming year, and you're going to give $65,000 to Second-Ponce, let us pray. Then you could say, the portion of this that goes to missions, I would like all of mine to go to the Southern Baptist Convention, or I would like all of mine to go to the CBF, or I would like it to go 50-50, right? And that way, the church didn't have to make a church action on whether they were this or this, because they were made up of people who were this or this, right? It kind of kept peace. And most of our churches did that. They took that route as a way of just keeping peace, but also letting people exercise their conscience. Doug Weaver is a church historian out of Baylor University, and Doug wrote Our Church History. And so because he was so familiar with Second-Ponce, he also wrote an article just describing how a Baptist church might have gone through this, what it looked like in a Baptist church that was trying to figure it out, right? Because he knew us, he knew the players. A great article. It goes into much more detail than I'm going into tonight because of time. I ran off 20 copies of it. It's very small print, but on the back table there are 20 copies. Some of you have interest in follow-up on that. It's really well done, and you're going to recognize all the names and the players. Second-Ponce's response, as I said, was to allow members to designate their mission giving. And the way that falls currently is we have roughly 65% designating CBF, 35% SBC, though that also represents, I got this run just last week, we actually have 3 people designate all of theirs to SBC. The rest of that 35% comes from people who are doing 50-50 for both, right? Thought you'd be interested in knowing kind of who our company is. This is not an exhaustive list, but I mentioned before that the Charleston tradition churches and what is now Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Church, or churches that allow for CBF giving. These are not churches that are all completely aligned, but allow for CBF giving. These are the churches, some of the churches on that list. What do you notice about that list? A whole lot of First Baptist, right? So just kind of going back to the earlier conversations, there's a whole lot of First Baptists up there because those are the churches that in their heritage have had an educated clergy. They could afford it, right? So they have always had a little more progressive, broad brush, but these are the churches who have always had a little more progressive look at the text than the very conservative, often more rural congregations. I don't know what I've got in here. In town, it's First Baptist Decatur, Smoke Rise Baptist, Wyuka Road, Dunwoody, Johns Creek, right. So, that was a lot. That's a lot.
Doc, can you mention anything about the missionaries that were overseas and this, that, and the other, and were asked to sign the Baptist faith and whatever that is? And so
Barbara Haig is asking about the missionaries overseas who were asked to sign the Baptist Faith and Message of 2000. I'm going to talk about that some more next week, but the Baptist Faith and Message we talked about some in an earlier presentation, is just kind of it's not a creed. Remember, Baptists aren't a creedal people, but it's a kind of a this we believe kind of. You don't have to. You can be Baptist and not believe, because every church is self-governing. But the Baptist Faith and Message of 1963 was written primarily by Herschel Hobbs, and it stood the test of time. After this shift happened in the 1980s, the Baptist Faith and Message was rewritten. Most of it kept the original language. It was so beautifully done the first time, but there were strategic changes to represent the new ideology. For instance, they wrote into the Baptist Faith and Message of 2000, and we believe that women cannot be senior pastors. So one of the things that happened after this shift happened, and our missionaries, for instance, overseas, they were now told by the Foreign Mission Board that they had to sign the new Baptist Faith and Message if they were going to remain missionaries, Southern Baptist missionaries. Now, they'd already moved their family to wherever, serving Baptists, but they couldn't continue to serve unless they agreed with this document, which was not, of course, the document's intent, and it had just been rewritten. So, much of the early funding for CBF was a rerouting to keep those missionaries employed when they wouldn't sign the Baptist Faith and Message of 2000. But we're going to talk a little bit more about the Baptist Faith and Message next week, because here's the teaser for next week. I know we've got to go to choir. Our Baptist identity has changed in the last 2 years accidentally. How about that for a tease? Our affiliations in Baptist life have changed accidentally. And that's what we're going to talk about next week. And I'm going to set, part of the setup for that will be talking some about the Baptist Faith and Message.
And Doc, I'm surprised that they didn't give him a chance to clean out his office. They just changed the law.
Yeah.
Go in and clean it out.
Yeah. Yeah, Jeremy's saying he's surprised that they didn't give him Russell Dilday a chance to clean out his office. Not all, how to say this, most of the people, in my judgment, who were part of that conservative movement were of good spirit and truly believed they were doing the right thing, preserving the integrity of the Bible. there were some leaders in that movement who were just mean and power hungry. And that's just one of many stories that represent something other than Christ-likeness. Certainly that was reciprocated by some unkind gestures as well, but this became a really ugly battle. Yeah. No, the question is whether or not Dr. Dilday and I ever got a chance to talk one-on-one about that. I did not. But this article has a lot from him in it, in the research done about this church. Yeah. All right, my time has come. Go in peace. Bring somebody with you Sunday, and again next Wednesday. We'll do this again.